The first wolf came on a Tuesday. Neve noticed it at the edge of the herb garden at the 3rd hour of the morning. A large grey shape at the tree line, not moving, not threatening, simply present in the way that large things sometimes were when they had decided to be somewhere and saw no reason to explain themselves. She was cutting feverfew in the early cold, her breath misting, her basket half full, and she looked at it across the garden the way she looked at most things that appeared without warning, with the calm, unhurried attention of a person who had decided, some years ago, that panicking was rarely the most efficient response to anything. The wolf looked back. Then it sat down. She finished cutting the feverfew. She went inside. When she looked out the window an hour later, the wolf was gone. She noted it in her treatment log, because she noted everything in her treatment log. The wolf had been Ryden's grey, she was reasonably certain, by the size and colouring and the particular quality of its amber eyes, which had the same cool, assessing quality that she had observed in the eyes of every wolf in the northern pack line, and which she had also observed from a respectful distance in the eyes of the Alpha King himself on the 3 occasions when his patrol had passed through the settlement in the past year. She noted, wolf present at tree line, 3rd hour, no approach. Filed it under observations and thought no more about it. By Thursday, there were 3. She was grinding dried willow bark at her workbench when she saw them, 2 at the tree line where the first had been, and a 3rd closer in, seated just outside the garden's stone boundary wall. None of them were approaching. None of them were threatening. They were simply there, in the settled way of animals that had decided to be somewhere and were content to wait. Neve set down the pestle. She went to the door and looked at the 3rd wolf, the one closest, outside the garden wall. It looked back at her with amber eyes. Its tail moved once in a slow, deliberate arc. She went back to her grinding. She was a healer. She had been the settlement healer for 6 years, since her teacher had died and left her the house and the herb garden and the practice and the particular responsibility of being the person everyone came to when something went wrong. She was 28 years old, slight and dark-haired, with sharp grey eyes that her patients often found unsettling because they assessed too quickly and too accurately, and hands that were steady from long training, even when everything else in a room was not. She did not have the gift of wolf sense. She was not wolf bloodline, had never been, came from a line of plain blood healers stretching back 4 generations. She could not feel the pack bond, or the mate recognition, or any of the supernatural machinery that ran beneath the surface of the Northern Territories. What she had was observation. What she had was 11 years of careful notes. She noted 3 wolves, boundary wall and tree line, no approach, tail arc from nearest, filed it, ground the willow bark, thought, with some precision, about what might cause this, and arrived at no satisfactory answer. By Saturday, there were 7. The Alpha King of the Northern Reach, King Ryden of the Ryden line, the line that had held the Northern Territories for 311 years without interruption, received his first report of the healer situation on the Friday. It was delivered by his second-in-command, a man named Arveth, who had the manner of someone reporting something he could not explain and had given up trying to. The pack wolves had been going to the settlement, not on his instruction, not in any organized patrol formation, simply going, individually and in small groups, of their own accord, to the tree line and boundary wall of the settlement healer's property, and sitting there. Ryden asked the relevant questions. He asked whether there had been any incident at the settlement, illness, threat, anything requiring a pack response. Arveth said, no. He asked whether the healer had made any request or signal. Arveth said, no. He asked whether the wolves were causing distress. Arveth paused and said, the healer seems to find them largely unremarkable. Ryden looked at Arveth for a moment. She noted it in her treatment log, Arveth said, with the expression of a man reporting something he wished he did not have to. Filed under observations. Ryden was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had been Alpha King for 14 years, who had led the Northern Pack through 2 succession challenges and a border conflict, and the difficult years after his father's death, and he had, in all of that time, not encountered a situation he could not place in a known category. This did not fit in a known category. His wolves were going to a healer's property of their own accord and sitting outside the garden wall, and the healer was filing them under observations. The Alpha King of the Northern Reach, whose pack had not bowed to any woman in 311 years, said, "Bring the account to me on Monday." He said this because he needed 2 days to determine whether the situation was supernatural, strategic, or simply strange, and because if it was what his instincts, pressing at the edge of his consideration, were suggesting it might be, he was not ready to act on that yet. He had been wrong about instincts before. He was going to be very certain before he moved. By Sunday morning, there were 14 wolves at the boundary of Neve's property. She had, at this point, stopped noting each individual instance and had moved to a running count in the margin of her treatment log, updated at each observation. She had also begun asking questions. Not of the wolves were not providing useful verbal information, but of herself, working through the problem the way she worked through a difficult diagnosis, systematically, ruling out explanations until she arrived at the ones that remained. They were not there because of illness. She had walked the property perimeter twice, and there was nothing wrong with the site. They were not there because of the herbs. Wolves had no particular interest in healing plants. They were not there because of a threat she had introduced. She had done nothing different in the past week, seen no unusual patients, made no unusual preparations. They were, as far as she could determine, simply there because they had chosen to be. And they had chosen to be in an arrangement that she had begun, with some discomfort, to recognize. They were not surrounding the property randomly. They were positioned at intervals, facing outward, their backs to her house. They were standing guard. She stood at the window on Sunday morning and looked at 14 wolves distributed around her property's perimeter, all facing outward, and she thought, with the precision of a person who had spent 11 years noting things and drawing accurate conclusions, that this was either a territorial claim or it was something she had no framework for. She had a framework for territorial claims. She had read the Northern Pack histories. She understood the mechanics. She put the kettle on and sat down at her workbench and wrote a very careful letter. She addressed it to the Alpha King of the Northern Reach. The letter said, in its precise and unhurried way, that she wished to inform him that 14 of his pack wolves were currently positioned around her property in what appeared to be a guard formation, that she had no objection to their presence as they had caused no disruption, but that she thought he might wish to know, as she was uncertain whether this had been authorized, and as she had no information that would allow her to interpret it correctly without his assistance. She sent it by the settlement's message rider at the 7th hour. By the time the rider reached the Alpha King's Hall, which was 4 miles from the settlement, a distance that Neve had calculated would put the letter in Ryden's hands by mid-morning, the count at her perimeter had risen to 22. Ryden read the letter at the 9th hour. He read it twice. He noted the handwriting, precise, unhurried, the script of someone who wrote without hesitation because they had decided what they wanted to say before they began writing. He noted the specific phrase, "I have no objection to their presence, as they have caused no disruption." He noted the phrase, "I thought you might wish to know." He noted that the letter contained no alarm, no demand, and no flattery. It was a letter of factual notification from a person who had encountered an anomaly and was correctly reporting it to the relevant authority. He had been Alpha King for 14 years. He had received letters from every category of person in the Northern Territories. He had not received a letter quite like this. He found Arveth. "How many?" he said. Arveth had received an updated count at the 8th hour. 22, he said, as of the last report. Ryden was quiet for a moment. He was a tall man, the tallest in his hall, which was not incidental in a wolf bloodline line, with dark red hair worn short, and the particular quality of composure that came not from the absence of feeling, but from its long and practiced containment. His eyes were pale grey, almost the colour of winter sky, and they had the same assessing quality in them that Arveth had noted with some personal discomfort in the eyes of the settlement healer. "She thinks it might not be authorized," he said. "Yes. She thinks she requires my interpretation to understand it correctly. That is what the letter says." Ryden folded the letter. He stood with it for a moment, the particular stillness of a man whose instincts had been pressing at the edge of his consideration for 4 days, and who had just been handed a very precise piece of evidence that was making it considerably harder to continue not acting on them. His wolf, present, fully present, none of the dissociation or suppression that had marked other Alpha Kings in other circumstances, was oriented toward the settlement with the absolute certainty of something that had known for 4 days and had been waiting for the man to catch up. "I will go," he said. Arveth received this without visible surprise. He had known Ryden for 14 years, and had learned that when the wolf oriented, the rest followed eventually. "Now," he said. "Now." Neve heard the horses at the 11th hour. She was not surprised. She had sent the letter expecting a response, and a response arriving by late morning was efficient. She tidied the workbench with the same unhurried motions she used for everything, put the current preparation aside, washed her hands, and went to the door. The wolves outside her perimeter had not moved from their positions, but they had done something she had not yet observed them do. As the sound of horses came up the track, the wolves turned, each one, smoothly and simultaneously, from facing outward to facing inward, toward her house. They were still outside the boundary wall. They were now looking at her door. She noted this. Then the gate opened, and Ryden came through. He came on foot from the gate. He had left the horse outside the wall, she observed, which was a choice that communicated something about his understanding of the situation, that he was arriving in her space as a person rather than as a mounted authority. And he walked up the path to her door through the silent, watching pack, which parted for him without instruction, but did not resume facing outward. They watched him walk past them, amber eyes following him toward the door. He was taller than she remembered from the patrol sightings. His dark red hair caught the thin winter sun. He moved with the particular physical certainty of someone whose body had never had occasion to be unsure of its own capability. He stopped at her door. Neve opened it before he knocked. "They turned inward when they heard you coming," she said, by way of greeting. Ryden looked at her. He had the pale grey eyes she had observed from a distance. Close, they were more specific. The grey of winter water, the grey of a person who was thinking, and not in the habit of hiding it. "Yes," he said. "Is that significant?" "Yes." "Would you like to come in," she said, "and explain what they are doing?" He came in. She put the kettle on, because she always put the kettle on when there was something to discuss that required sitting down, and she sat at the workbench and looked at him across it with the sharp grey eyes that had unsettled every patient she had ever had, and he sat across from her and looked back without being unsettled, which was, she noted with some precision, a thing she had not previously encountered. He told her about the mate recognition. He told her about the territorial claim, the pack behavior that preceded and sometimes surpassed the Alpha King's own awareness, the way the pack registered what the bond had chosen before the man had processed it. He told her that what was outside her wall was not authorized because it had not required his authorization. The pack had acted on the bond's direction, not on his. 311 years, he said, at the end of the account. The Ryden line. No woman in that time has had the pack's territorial claim made for her without the Alpha King's direction. He paused. I am telling you this because the claim is yours to accept or decline, and I am not prepared to have it exercised without your understanding of what it means. Neve looked at him for a long moment. And your own assessment, she said, independent of the pack. He looked at her. The pale grey eyes were direct, the same assessing quality as hers, and in them, she was a careful reader of people, 11 years of practice, was the expression of a man who had been pressing something at the edge of his consideration for 4 days, and had now arrived at the place where he no longer needed to press it at a distance. "My own assessment," he said, "is that I came here with every intention of being careful and impartial, and I have been in this room for 6 minutes, and I am finding that considerably more difficult than I anticipated." She looked at him for a long moment more. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in some time." She got up and poured the tea. She set a cup in front of him. She sat back down. She looked at the workbench surface between them. Her notes, her preparations, the treatment log with its running count in the margin. And then she looked at him. "I am a plain blood healer," she said. "I have no wolf sense. I cannot feel the bond or the pack or the claim. I can only observe what is happening and draw conclusions from the evidence." "I know," he said. "And from the evidence," she said carefully, "my conclusion is that something has decided something, and the question is whether the people involved are in agreement with it." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you," he said, "in agreement with it?" She considered the question the way she considered every question, with full attention, without performance, taking the time the question actually required. "I think," she said, "that I am in the process of becoming so, which is the most accurate answer I can give you at this point." Something shifted in his pale grey eyes. Not warmth, something more fundamental than warmth. A foundation settling. "That," he said, "is sufficient." Outside, the 22 wolves had not moved. They were facing inward, watching the door, in the patient and absolute manner of something that had already decided, and was waiting for the rest of the world to finish catching up. At some point in the next hour, Niamh noted the time, because she noted everything. The count outside her wall became 23. The 23rd wolf was Ryden's grey, the one that had come first, on Tuesday, and sat at the tree line and looked at her with amber eyes. It positioned itself directly in front of her door. 3 months later, it was ordinary, not unremarkable. There were still settlement residents who paused when they came up the path and found wolves distributed along the garden wall with the settled patience of animals who had been doing this for some time and saw no reason to stop. There were still supply riders from the capital who arrived at the gate and had to be talked through the experience of being regarded by 23 amber-eyed wolves who were collectively, benignly, and absolutely certain about something. There were still mornings when Niamh looked out at the perimeter and thought, "This is my life now," and held that thought with a quality of attention that was not quite wonder and not quite amusement, but occupied the particular space between them. What was ordinary? The grey wolf at her door. It had been there every morning since the Tuesday after Ryden's first visit. Not always the same wolf. Sometimes it was 3, sometimes 5, sometimes just the grey. But the grey was reliably there, in the first light of every morning, positioned at the door's threshold, with the settled authority of something that had taken up a post and did not require relief. Her patience had grown accustomed to stepping over it. The grey had grown accustomed to being stepped over. Neither party found the arrangement remarkable. What was also ordinary? Ryden. He came to the settlement twice a week on the days that were not command days, which Niamh had observed was a significant restructuring of his schedule, and which he had not commented on, and which she had not mentioned, because it was his schedule to restructure. He came on foot from the gate, the same way he had come the first time, the pack parting for him, and then resuming their positions. He sat across the workbench from her, and they talked, about the pack histories she had been reading, about the herbal preparations she was developing for the winter fever season, about the border situation in the eastern passes, which was his concern, and which she had informed views on from 11 years of treating its medical consequences. He was not a man who said more than the situation required. She was not a woman who said more than she meant. The silences between them were of the functional kind, not empty, not filled, simply the pauses of two people thinking in close proximity. She had shown him the treatment log, all of it, from the first entry, wolf present at tree line, 3rd hour, no approach, through the running count and the letter and the notes she had made on each of his visits. He had read every entry with the same focused attention he brought to everything. When he reached the entry for his first visit, Alpha King arrived 11th hour, explained pack claim and mate recognition mechanics, appeared to find the room more relevant than expected. Something moved through his face that she had identified by now as his version of being pleased and unable to prevent it from showing. More relevant than expected, he said. I write what I observe, she said. I know, he said. That is one of the things I find, he paused, relevant. She was making a preparation at the bench when he said this. She did not stop making the preparation, but she noted it with the same precision she applied to everything, and filed it in the part of the log she had begun keeping in her own mind rather than on parchment, the record of the things he said that were, in their sparse and careful way, the closest he came to the vocabulary of what had been decided between them. It had been decided between them without ceremony, without a formal declaration or a public claim or any of the institutional trappings that such decisions apparently sometimes involved, according to the pack histories she had been reading. It had been decided across a workbench over tea and treatment logs and the quiet certainty of 22 wolves facing inward, and it had the quality of all correctly made decisions. It felt less like a thing that had been chosen and more like a thing that had been found, already there, waiting to be noticed. The grey wolf was asleep at her feet when she arrived at this thought. She looked down at it. It opened one amber eye. I know, she said. You knew first. The wolf closed the eye. Outside, through the workroom window, the winter morning was coming up clear and cold, and along the perimeter of the herb garden, the pack had resumed their positions, outward-facing, settled, the absolute and unhurried certainty of something standing guard over a thing it had decided mattered. The impossible had been patiently made ordinary, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Have you ever had something choose you before you knew what was choosing?